Welcome to Voices from the Field from the NeuroArts Resource Center. We're here today and excited to have a conversation with Christopher Bailey, who is the Arts and Health Lead at the World Health Organization and also the co-founding director of the Jameel Arts and Health Lab. And Chris is also my dear friend. And we have had many conversations together talking about arts and health, neuroarts, global affairs, our kids, our families, our lives, our aspirations. And so it's really wonderful to be here with you today to talk about this work.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, Susan. I guess the only thing that's unusual about it is that we're recording it.
It's true. It's true. But we should act as if we're not.
Oh,
It's it's really great to spend time with you always. And, as I have shared with you in the past, the NeuroArts Resource Center was built as a virtual watering hole, a place where anybody interested in arts and can come together to find each other, to find things that they're looking for, hopefully answers to questions, but also to share their voices and their knowledge and their work. And we've only launched a month ago, and already it's really been a resounding success in terms of people coming and coming back. And so we're excited to lift up voices who are on the Resource Center. And I wanted to start by just getting you to share with us a bit about how you got into this work and what really has inspired you to continue to build such an amazing programs within this space.
well, I wish I could say it was this extremely well thought out, well executed plan that I uh, constructed and uh, lived out over the last few years, but it wasn't. It was an improvisation. I'm a firm believer in Nietzsche's definition of human happiness, amor fati, where when you reach that moment of your life where you realize, okay, there were many things that happened that you were in control over, and many more which you were not. But if you can reach that moment where you realize that everything that has happened inevitably led to this moment, and this moment is good, that's human happiness. And in some ways, that's the way I feel about my arts and health work, that it made sense over time. But very briefly, in my WHO work, working in health informatics, I would often use theater techniques to engage the community, specifically Augusta Boal's Theater of the Oppressed, Forum Theater, where instead of going into an HIV clinic in rural Africa with a new technology and my recommendations of what they should do, I literally would go in with a half-written script, and we would use role play and other techniques to finish out that narrative. So what we came up with was not just a sense of ownership, but actual ownership, actual engagement. And meanwhile, evenings and weekends in Geneva, I was helping run a theater company in in Geneva, and I found myself bringing in themes of health and development, mental health, and all of that, which uh, began to spur local conversation. The American mission here in Geneva became interested and began to engage local hospitals and groups to have these conversations with the audience after the show, and it began to spread. And so that potential was percolating in my mind when Dr. Tedros was first elected. He then put out a famous call to staff for crazy ideas, and I thought, okay, well, let's. I've been trying to fold in the arts into my health technical work, and I've been trying to fold health technical themes into my arts work. Why not just do it openly? And so I made my pitch to Dr. Tedros, and he said yes, and voila, here we are.
It's amazing how following your passion has actually created such an amazing imprint on the world. And I know you travel all over the world seeking out groups that are already doing things or are really interested in sort of percolating and wanting to come together to think about how the arts can be more a part of daily ways of dealing with really difficult issues. Can you talk a little bit about some of the places that you've been and some of the programs that you've seen? I think of Ukraine, that comes up right now for me as
Oh,
such a.
let's definitely talk about Ukraine, but I guess the first one that pops into my head is Nigeria, and it you know I talked about some of the work that I was doing in folding in the arts into health technical work, and how the big revolution was to, instead of trying to tell people what my expertise was on a particular subject, to engage them through compassionate listening and to support their expression. And that has, I think, been the secret ingredient. And just to give you one anecdotal example from last fall, um, I was in a refugee camp in outside of Abuja, and I was talking with the self-selected leaders of that refugee camp who had done some amazing arts-related work to build social cohesion, to deal with some of the mental health issues that were there. And I asked them a question that I always ask any community group or clinical group. I said, what are some of the major health issues that you're facing? And they, all of them said, without hesitation, witchcraft.
Mm,
I said, okay, so I can understand that. What do you mean? Do you have any examples of that? And they said, well, yes, there's someone under a spell just over the bush. Um, and I said, well, can we meet this person? And so we did. We walked outside of the camp, and sure enough, not far away was this older gentleman who was talking to himself and was yelling and was extremely agitated. And from just observing him, it was pretty clear that he had dementia.
mm,
So I asked if there was anyone here who knew him, and one woman said that she was from the same village.
mm.
I said, "Well, um, do you think you would know a song that he might recognize from his childhood?" And she said that she thought so. And I said, "Could you sing it?" So she sang the song,
Mm.
and it was something like, "The crickets, they sing, the crickets sing all day, all day, all day." And he heard that, and he stopped, and he listened, and he began to sing along, and he knew the verses. And as he sang, he began to recognize some of the people there and understood who he was and where he was.
Mm.
And the group was astonished. And at one point, um, one of the leaders came up to me and said, "Are you a witch?"
Wow.
And I said, "No, he's suffering from something called Alzheimer's." And what we've learned about the neurology of Alzheimer's is that music, because it has an all brain effect, we can see it in the MRIs, it can offer detours around the damaged areas and offer moments of connection to memory, to relationships, to presence that otherwise would have escaped that
Mm.
individual. And I said, it's not a cure. It'll pass in a few minutes, but it's just a moment of
Mm.
relief. And they said, so what should we do? And I said, you need to bring him back into the community. You need to feed him and take care of him, and you should sing to him 3 times a day.
And there you go, social prescribing, right? You
There
know,
you go.
we, it's when you say this and you say it in a community that is uh, so far from the U.S., um, you know, we now know that these kinds of experiences that are affordable and they're immediate and they're accessible, right? Anywhere. And
Anyone can sing.
any anybody can sing, whether you're a good singer or not a good singer. But those memories, those autobiographical memories, are so amazing. We just finished a economic analysis to underscore that on singing engagement, or actually music engagement, and an economic return. And what we found is that if people sing once a week for a year, and 30% of people with Alzheimer's have this experience. In the US alone, there would be a $5 billion savings in costs, both for the caregiver and for the family and patient. And so when you multiply that, by more of a percentage, but also around the world, and you start to think about how could you redeploy these resources for music therapists, for other kinds of arts that would be really beneficial to quality of life, and not just one person, but the entire community. And I feel like that's something that we've seen these beautiful examples. And over the last several years, the community of artists and arts practitioners, therapists, researchers, policymakers, communities are now coming together, and I think really working to create a virtuous cycle of the way the arts are being used. And
Well, Susan, I mean, what you're bringing up is something that policymakers pay attention to, that's for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Uh, our mutual friend Daisy Fancourt has been doing a lot of work recently with multi-year cohort data that looks at the intersection between being involved in cultural activities and health outcomes.
Mm,
And one of the results of that she's extracted from this data set is that people who are involved in cultural activities show a drop in rates of self-reported rates of depression,
mhm,
from 30% to 20%, or 35% to 25%, but
mm,
it's a 10% drop. And and you're right. I think from a health system point of view, that is a huge, huge benefit. But for me, I'm interested in that bottom 20%,
mm,
the ones that actually it didn't have a preventative effect.
mm,
And I think part of the beauty of arts interventions and creative expression is that even if you are chronically depressed, you can still find ways of coping with the everyday stresses of life. You
mm,
can still find ways of practicing your abilities to their highest individual potential. You can still find ways of being productive, of contributing to community, and even acknowledging moments of joy. And when you offer that to people who suffer from these chronic conditions, the hope that it gives them is palpable, because
yeah.
suddenly they don't feel like failures for not being able to shake off the depression. They can take adversity and find a personal meaning and a sense of belonging in it anyway through it. And that I think is important too.
Totally. And if you've not felt joy or happiness in a long time, to have that sensation is
Oh,
extraordinary. It makes me think of the red nose clown work, like laughter, right? I mean, laughter is such a healing thing. And, sometimes I think I haven't laughed in a long time, and I haven't laughed hard in a long time. And you did that fun thing with the clowns where everybody wears the red nose, right? And you go into hospitals, and the contagious aspect of laughter is really also healing.
well, there was an interesting study that was done a few years ago that looked at uh, monkeys, actually. And what the researchers did was they introduced a stuffed predator to cause a threat, an artificial threat to this group of monkeys. And the first monkey that saw the cheetah or the leopard or whatever it was would let out this warning call, and the rest of the clan would echo that shriek, that warning call. And of course, all of the monkeys' cortisol levels would go up, their adrenaline would go up, they'd go into fight or flight mode. Um, and then when a monkey discovered that it was fake, it let off this all clear signal that sounded like hee 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 hee. And that was repeated by all of the other monkeys. Now, not only did the cortisol levels and the adrenaline levels plummet, but it was replaced by oxytocin, the bonding hormone. So
Interesting.
there was a sense of community and connectedness when it was a false alarm. But where it gets interesting is that there was always some monkey that would recognize that effect and then create false threats in order to get that reaction. And that might be the origin of the first comedians.
Oh, that's interesting. So the Shakespearean jester was a monkey, is what you're saying.
That's right. And it was to get that bonding reaction, that sense of
Yeah.
relief.
You
Uh,
know, I think I get that. I totally, totally get that. That combination between fear and release, right? And pure, unmitigated sort of, ah, yeah.
and most humor is setting up something that makes you uncomfortable, and then it gets resolved in an ironic way, right? Um, so,
The other thing you bring up that is really interesting to me is the that stress moves, fear moves through a crowd very fast, but so does joy and relief and a
oh
sense
my
of
gosh, yeah.
calm and the synchronicity that the arts also create from a neurophysiological perspective in terms of our brains actually working at the same wavelengths when we're involved in the same kind of experience. So I think about with theater, with what you do, you know, you're in training a group as they're being entrained with you, right? They're getting in harmony with you and they're experiencing that together. And that's another form of bonding that I think we also need now more than ever.
Well, and I think it works on so many different levels. I think music, for instance, when you listen to a line of music, oftentimes um, it the chord progressions going from the tonic to the subdominant to the dominant in that first phase, it creates a sense of anticipation, which heightens the dopamine levels, which makes you focus and wonder what's going to happen next. You become expectant, but then when again it resolves itself in a way that makes total musical sense, but wasn't what you were expecting.
Mm.
Uh, then that's when the oxytocin kicks in again. And so you have that tingling sensation, that sensation of awe that
Mm.
you and again, because it's oxytocin, it helps support this sensation of community and connectedness.
Mm.
And sometimes that connectedness can be also to yourself, your past, the physical environment around you, which is why awe is such a powerful tool in trauma recovery, for
Mm.
instance. Where in trauma you have that dissociation, and if you can create a moment where you can support a feeling of connectedness,
Mm.
it goes a great uh, length to helping re-enter the world again.
You know, awe has been something that I've always been interested in, curiosity and awe. And recently, somebody introduced some work around inspiration, which is
Mm.
super interesting. But one of the studies I saw about awe that blew my mind, everything you said in terms of awe making you feel part of something bigger, but that awe also does this very amazing thing, which it will allow you to take risks that you wouldn't have normally taken. And if you're going to transform, if you're going to transcend out of something, you have to do something you haven't done before, right? And so this ability to take a risk is something that I had not really thought about before. But I want to come back to your work as you share so much of this through performance. And I'd love to just hear a bit about what happens when you give a performance. You know, what's the audience reaction to this, and how do you feel about the work that you're sharing?
Well, I guess I'll just pick the most recent one. Last week, I was in London. I had been invited by Shakespeare's Globe. They commissioned me to create a piece on Shakespeare and well-being. And it was part of their Shakespeare Talks series. And I think what everyone was expecting was a technical officer from WHO coming in and having a PowerPoint and lecturing on, God knows what. And instead, I came in, I took my spot, and I recited the "To Be or Not to Be" monologue, but in Ukrainian.
Wow.
I memorized it in Ukrainian, and the audience, just from the cadence and the emotions, I think could tell that which soliloquy it was, or could guess at it, but they didn't necessarily recognize the language. And then when I was done, and I started talking about the work that we had been doing with the Unbroken Project in Lviv, taking former prisoners of war and using the arts to help literally recover from a psychotic state. I have on my phone EEG images of their brains, which show no brain activity in the frontal cortex when they arrive. They were literally in a psychotic state.
Mm.
Uh, and how when they um, uh, if you use traditional talk therapy, that would inevitably lead to a flashback to the moment of torture,
Mm.
which would create a violent moment and did nothing to help them. Drugs, antipsychotic drugs, or opiates or antidepressants in small amounts could help them sleep, but did nothing to regenerate the brain activity. The only thing that worked was art therapy, and within 6 weeks, their brains, their brain activity had returned to within a normal range.
Mm.
And so then suddenly the audience, after I tell that story, is thinking about the "To Be or Not to Be" monologue in a totally different way,
Mm.
and thinking, yes, to express, to connect is to be. And if you can't do that because of a traumatic incident or whatever, you do not you do not exist, literally.
Mm.
Uh, and so, and then as the former prisoners began to deal with that recovery and began to process these events, they began to think of the monologue in different ways. For some, it was intimations of self-harm, of course, which they experienced. But for others, it was about the state itself. Is Ukraine going to exist or not?
Mhm.
And then for the caregivers, it was a third notion that if we are successful and they are released from hospital, they'll be sent back to the front. And so "To Be or Not to Be" meant something different to each person depending on their context.
Mm.
And I was explaining to them that I had this gig coming up at the Globe Theater, and one of the participants in this project asked me if I could perform his "To Be or Not to Be" monologue in Ukrainian at the Globe when I was there. And I said, well, I don't know if I can. That's difficult to memorize something in Ukrainian. And then I found out that he had died on the front line of the net. I thought I ought to do this.
Wow.
So I did, and his presence was there. And the audience gasped.
Mm. As you're speaking, what comes to me is this huge feeling of what it means to be human, what it means to be us, and how we need all of those feelings: grief, pain, suffering, joy, and we need them together. We need to be able to really come together. And this work, to me, does that so perfectly. And I think that motivation to be human is something that drives so many people in this space, in this field. And I want to shift. I know, like always, we're going to run out of time. I want to talk about.
That's why we keep talking.
I know. That's why I love it. I know it's the never-ending conversation. I know, and it's great. It's a blessing. But has the NeuroArts work, the work that you've been doing with the WHO and Jameel Arts and Health Lab has grown along with so many programs around the world. And I'd love to shift to kind of pull out a little bit. And what do you think are some of the things that we need to be doing as a field now? And what do you think are some of our biggest challenges that we need to work together to resolve?
Well, I think the most common answer to that question is, oh, more research is needed. And I'm not sure that's even true, frankly. I think there's enough research now to say, yes, the arts do have these health benefits. I think I'm the last person to over attribute them, and I think we need to always be mindful, not to outrun the evidence base. But at the same time, I think it's kind of a cop out to say, oh, we need to do more research. I think what we need to do is address the very real societal issues that are most acute right now, that we see from the evidence the arts have a special place in addressing, such as social connectedness, such as resiliency, such as um, uh, taking people from different points of view, respecting their different points of view, and finding a way forward together. Um, as an example, some of the work that I was doing in northern Nigeria was working with groups that use dance to bring together Islamic communities and Christian communities that were historically at enmity with each other. And it wasn't like, the dance in the gym at West Side Story, right?
Mm.
Literally choreographed it together, and each of them bringing their story to the dance, and then creating something that where they weren't trying to convince the other to their beliefs. They were themes that harmonized together.
Mm.
And so that's, I think, one of the things that the arts can do. It's not about convincing someone to your point of view. It's about listening and responding.
And having a large container for many ways to live your life, right? You mentioned creative
That's right.
expression. We all,
And again, it's so powerful in these post-conflict settings. Another Ukrainian example, for instance, was in a Lviv community center, seeing these young people, preteens mostly, who had been forcibly displaced from the Eastern Front, and many of them were showing physical signs of dissociation, depression, shock, dark circles under their eyes, loss of hair, things like young people, right? Uh, and they were uncommunicative. And in this session that I attended, they played some Ukrainian music, and the instruction was very simple. It was match the speed and movement of the person next to you, and that's it. That's the only instruction. So there was no choreography at all. So what we were witnessing was an example of flocking behavior in nature. And so the result was, suddenly there was this complex, intricate dance, this group dance that emerged from this group intelligence, from a few simple rules, that was endlessly variable, but it also forced them to pay attention to each other, to connect. And the laughter was contagious. And just to look at the expressions on their faces, it was like seeing a uh, a sudden cloudburst on the desert, and then the spring flowers jumping up out of the barren desert. The smiles on their faces were like those blooming flowers. I mean, it was just so remarkable.
and instant and instantaneous, which
Instantaneous.
right, like you can't get that from anything.
Yeah. And then they report back that they begin to sleep at night.
Yeah, you start to see
This
busy.
real palpable
Yeah,
benefits.
yeah.
And I think in terms of the long-term effects, there was the Music and Mums program that was done in the UK, that through our European office we've expanded to various countries, where they use singing groups to help mothers who were experiencing postpartum depression to help recover. And it was a very successful program. But one of the things that wasn't measured, that I found remarkable about it, was, and I heard about it anecdotally at first, but we followed up and it turns out to be true, is that after the 6 weeks of the study, um, they kept singing together for
Mhm.
years.
Yeah. You
So
build a,
that
you build a behavior, you build a way of
exactly.
living. Yeah.
And a community, and it's just the enjoyment of it. They weren't doing it
Mhm.
ostensibly for their health or mental health. They were doing it because it was fun
Yeah.
and they liked each other. I mean, the joy. And that's the other thing when we start talking about the clinical benefits of these things. Um, I say, well, let's not lose sight of the fact that it's fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Right, which is always like a nice to have to have. This is that policy argument, right? Where if you don't
Yeah,
button it down, you're not going to get a policy. And in the same time, I think we've been conditioned to believe that fun is not necessarily the most important thing. But if something is fun, you're going to do it again and again and again. And that's behavior change, that's brain health. That's,
positive reinforcement,
yeah. And
right?
so changing the
And
narrative.
And even the assumption that that can't be the argument to policymakers, well, maybe not on paper, but I think we found through our healing arts activations that we've been doing through the lab that one of the recipes that has emerged is instead of trying to argue to policymakers, here's our evidence, this is what you should do. We just create these events where we have policymakers, researchers, practitioners, artists, and the general public experience these things together.
Mhm.
And when the policymakers feel that tingling sensation, they go, oh, everyone should have this. And then they come to us and say, okay, how should we frame the policy? This is what happened in Scotland. This is what's happened around the world. And so, yeah, they may not admit that fun is an argument, but it is. They're human.
And there's many kinds of policy. That's one of the things that we've thought a lot
Yeah.
about. Is there's school policy, there's work policy, there's municipal,
Home policy.
there's home policy, there's policy everywhere. If you want to think about the word, like what's important to you, what do you value, and what do you support. And so this work I often think is the holy grail may be federal policy in some level because in some countries the arts are covered through healthcare, and that's extraordinary. But it's one kind of policy, and I think we need to be thinking broadly about all the ways, big and small.
Well, I'm such a word geek that whenever we find ourselves stuck, I always go to etymology. And policy in the ancient Greek means simply a way of working in the city.
Mm, mm,
That's all it means.
yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean law or anything like that. It's how do we consensually agree to move forward together?
Yeah,
And
that's good.
so um, I guess growing up in my household, our policy was to sing songs together.
Hmm.
That was, I guess, a policy, but we didn't think of it that way. But that's what we did, and the result is, I have two sons where music is a part of their life every day.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, and you live it, right? You live it. And that, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Well, so tell me more about kind of what the future looks like for you. Where are you going to be moving your efforts to now?
oh well, if I knew that, I could sell my prognosticating abilities to the highest bidder. Well, at this very moment of recording, WHO is going through a major downsizing. So uh, I, like everyone else at WHO, doesn't even know if we're going to have a job in 2 weeks. So because of the pullout of the U.S. and the funding crunch, there's a 20% culling that's happening of WHO staff at the moment. So, in to answer your question literally, the answer is I don't know. But also, to answer the question emotionally, it doesn't matter. I think at this point, the need is clear. The techniques are sound, and in you know when you are trained and grow up as an actor, companies may change, but the technique is there.
Mm.
So if it's not WHO, it's something else. And so, uh, what the next phase may be WHO. I don't know, but if it's not, then it's a different logo,
I think
whatever that.
that's one of the things about this field that is so generative, is that it's not reliant on a single institution or a single person, but there is a drumbeat, and we all have part of that rhythm. And I've seen it just get more consistent. And so, whether you move to another place, or I do, or others that have been doing this work, it is happening. Like, I think it's embedded. And that's not to say that it isn't hard, and that there aren't a lot of things that need to be done in order to hopefully make this work sustainable for the folks that are in it now, but also for the next generation, of people that are really
It's the next generation that I worry about. Like, I may very well keep my job, but I think the moral injury of witnessing so many younger people who having their careers disrupted in the health sector, in the development sector, has already been devastating. And especially because the people who have relied on us, there is often no current alternative. So the damage that is happening, I don't think has even been quantified yet, and that's what keeps me up at night.
Yeah.
The abdication of any notion of duty of care. If you're going to pull out the money, fine, I guess, but you do it in an orderly way that causes the least amount of harm. I mean, the first rule in medicine is do no harm.
Right.
And to intentionally do harm, as these policies do, is an abomination. It's absolutely unforgivable. But it's also the people who had been the stewards of this work. That's a form of trauma as well.
Yeah. No. Huge.
Of even things that are outside of your control, and that's something that we have to deal with. And so part of the work moving forward is to acknowledge the pain, acknowledge the reality of it, but also process those feelings of guilt and powerlessness into something that is proactive and can rebuild.
And that's a healing process that takes its course for each of us. But I think this is another place where these arts practices and, in some ways, arts interventions are really helpful. We're seeing that, with USAID and with other organizations, who the sense of guilt also about leaving your post and not being, and actually also,
that's moral injury.
Yeah.
That's moral injury.
And actually seeing people without compensation, without payment, continuing to do some of that work because of a commitment to others. And I think that's what humans are about, is a commitment to each other, of being there for each other. And, creative expression is a piece of that, and what it does at all these different levels that you've talked about.
And I think it goes way back to the origins of the imagination in our species. If you go back 70,000 years to roughly the midpoint of the brief life of our species, you see in the fossil record two events that happen. The first event is the first cave paintings that show a human body with an animal's head, something that doesn't exist in nature, the magic what if.
Yeah.
At the same time, you also have in the fossil record the first instances of a healed femur. And when you think about it, up until that moment in the history of life on this planet, that's never happened. With an injury that grievous, you are left to die because you are an impediment to the survival of the tribe. So when you have something like a healed femur, several things have to happen in order for that femur to heal. First of all, you have to imagine that person could get better. Secondly, you have to imagine a technique that could allow that person to get better. And then thirdly, you have to put the entire tribe at risk for the vulnerable individual and have a conception that that's actually for the benefit of all.
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge leap of the imagination. And so to me, that magic what if, that moment of creativity, is both the founding of artistic expression, but it's also the founding of the hypothesis of medical science, and that common origin has still some shared DNA today. And I think one of them is this notion of compassion, of putting the, risking the success of the group to help the vulnerable individual. And that's an unfinished battle of the heart that is still playing out today. But again, I think of etymology. The word compassion comes from the Latin compassio, which means struggle together.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't, uh, feeling what someone's feeling, empathizing with them. It can, but what it really means is saying your success is my success, your failure is my failure. I commit to making your life better.
No, I love that. And I feel like right now we are coming back to that in such a deep, meaningful way. This idea of imagining what the future could look like, or just imagining in general, and combined with this idea of compassion. And, we are, I think, we're in a very volatile moment in history for lots of reasons. And I think coming to compassion, coming to love, coming to creative expression for all of these things that really make us human. And especially, even if you just look at something like technology, we have senses. And I think our sensory systems are these exquisite ways to bring in the world and to process it in our unique ways. Machines are sensors. And so how do we dance between the senses and the sensors? And how do we make sure that it's humanity, this deepest definition of humanity, that really sustains us? I've gotten really into the term quality of life lately, because we throw it off. Quality of life, quality of life. But what does it really mean to live a good life, to live a life
Well,
of quality?
exactly. And I think we're often stuck in a medical model where we only think in terms of reducing
Right.
deficits and we don't think about the
Mm-hmm.
assets, right? So we think about reducing symptoms or disability or disease, but we don't think about what it means to live a fulfilled life, to support people on their human, individual, and collective quest for authentic meaning and a sense of belonging. And that's what the arts can give. That's what creative expression was created to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, you know, yeah, I'd like to live a long life without disease, but I've already experienced
Mm-hmm.
disease. I've I've had cancer. I've been told that I had a 50% chance of surviving the year, and spoiler alert, I lived. Uh, I I've had glaucoma. I've lost most of my vision. So the fact that I haven't been able to avoid these conditions, does that make me unhealthy? No, because despite or maybe because of these adversities, um, I have found ways of coping. I have found ways of being able to practice my abilities to their highest degree. I have found ways of contributing to community. I have found ways of finding my joy
Mm-hmm.
in spite of, or maybe because of, these adversities. You talk about the senses. Aristotle identified five senses, and we've been kind of stuck on that number for millennia. But neurologically, as you know, that there are over a dozen senses
Mm-hmm.
actually. and
And more being
that's
discovered all the time, right? That's the
exactly.
cool thing about humanity.
Yeah, that's where it gets interesting, and when you lose one, you became acutely aware of the others
Yeah.
because you begin to depend on them. But particularly in our work in trauma recovery, one of the senses that a lot of people aren't even aware of, that is such an important part in understanding trauma, is proprioception.
Hmm.
And for those people listening that don't know the term, it's that part of the brain that maps to a sense of ownership of your body, of your relationships to the world around you. To give an example, if you can put your hands to the side of your body and have a sense of where they are, that's proprioception. And when you have experienced trauma, that gets disrupted.
Hmm.
You literally have a mind out of body experience because the proprioception shuts down. And and we've seen that dance, music, narrative actually can restart your sense of proprioception. It literally heals dissociation
Mm.
by associating.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And to be able to call on those somatic, intuitive birthrights to be able to heal
Yep.
is just extraordinary. It's,
Well, when I lost my sight, one of the things that the doctor told me was that I will, over time, develop echolocation, which is literally the visual cortex not getting enough information. Using the neuroplasticity of the brain will rewire neural pathways to the auditory senses. So literally, it's the visual cortex processing audio information. And I said, great, when does that happen? And he laughed and said, well, I don't know,
right.
but know that it always happens. And sure enough, it did with me, where I began to get these oral pictures of the space around me. And I began to think about the fact that this happens to everyone that loses their sight. So that means it's a fail-safe that's coded in the DNA. And we know that in evolution, nothing happens without a reason. So what this means is that in the course of human evolution, it is expected that a certain number of people in the population will lose their sight and develop this ability. Why? Because it's of value to the group.
Hmm. E.O. Wilson talked about eusocial, that we are a eusocial group, and other species are like ants and bees. Where the hive, the community, is more important than the individual, and that there's allowances that are made, and humans are known to be eusocial, which I think is an extraordinary concept. Like, how do we take care of each other? But I want you to,
Yeah.
before we leave, I want.
Well, on that, I just want to say, because it's a political issue in the U.S., to me, individuality and social communal identity are not mutually exclusive. One in many, and it is not socialist to think about the group. It is not abdicating a sense of individuality to consider yourself as part of a group. And I think, particularly in arts, we have an intuitive understanding of that because you have a role to play,
Mhm.
but that role becomes more meaningful when it's in the cast.
Right, right. And your community doesn't just have to be your country, right? Or your
Yeah,
state or your family. It's the world. We're in so many communities all the time. And to allow those boundaries to not be there and to move into these new spaces, I think is also something that is really essential to not bifurcate in that way. Um, Before we go, I want you to tell the story of when you got your echolocation, when you knew it was there.
oh, well, that was a very specific incident that happened in Washington, D.C., of all places. I was in Washington for a meeting, I think it was with PEPFAR, and uh, it was at Easter time, and I had heard that Mozart's Requiem Mass was being played at the National Cathedral, and it's one of my favorite pieces anyway.
Beautiful.
So I went to the National Cathedral to listen to this performance, and as I'm listening to it, it's very familiar but still stirring every time you hear it. Um, Something happened where I realized I wasn't just listening to the melody or the pitch or the volume. I was literally feeling the music passing through the physical space. And as I started experiencing the music inhabiting the cathedral itself, the Gothic arches, the soft texture of the flesh, of the clothing of the humans sitting in the chairs began to form an oral image. And I thought, oh my God, I literally am regaining my sight in the church.
Amazing.
And it was that moment when the echolocation literally kicked in and I began to experience it. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense that sound is a vibration and energy that passes through matter, unlike sight, which is literally reflecting off of matter. Sound, if you listen to it, um, properly, as something that is moving through matter. The same sound you are listening to, that I'm listening to, is literally connecting
Mm,
us physically. It has a sense of bonding that is palpable, and not just literally superficial, the way sight is. And and so in that moment, it wasn't just a tool or a technique that suddenly blossomed. It was also a profound sense of calm because instead of feeling exiled from the world, which I had up until that moment, I felt a deeper and more profound connection to it.
mm.
And that was the blessing.
I mean, you really, your body, I think of it as almost metamorphosis. You had this metamorphosis, physical and spiritual. That's one of my favorite places in the world. And I think
Mm.
about Easter, birth, death, and rebirth in that moment. But when you come to the National Cathedral, there's three reliefs outside. One is chaos before the world was formed. One is the forming of the world, and then there's the universe. And it always reminds me of that process of in creativity. We go through those moments like in a spiral over and over and over again. And that space is just one of the most sacred spaces, I think.
Well, a lot of people criticize Christians for taking the Bible literally. I actually take the Bible literally. When I read the first chapters of Genesis and I think about light being separated from dark and the horizon line, and then land and sea and concepts of air being formed, and then animals and relationships, I think about our first moments of life on this planet when we are born, and the world is all a jumble of information, and we begin to discriminate between light and dark, hot and cold, soft and rough, and then that moment of in that chaos. I mean, what's the first thing that happens when we're born? We leave the dark comfort of the womb, and then suddenly there's light and noise, and it's terrifying. And what's the first thing we do? We scream. It's a traumatic event, but that traumatic event, instead of scarring us, actually jumpstarts our
And gets us
cardiopulmonary
to
system.
breathe,
Allows us
right?
to live.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And then at that moment, we feel the soft touch of the mother's breast. The rooting behavior kicks in. We have our first nourishment of mother's milk, and we hear the voice of the mother that we recognize from the womb as being there still, and our eyes catch. And in that moment, our ability to form mirror neurons is generated in our midbrain.
Mm.
We develop that moment of being able to empathize and connect to the world on an emotional level. And to me, in a symbolic way, that's Genesis.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
And you're
the
not
birth,
alone.
just a connection
Yeah.
of the sorting of the senses. So I take the Bible literally.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. Well, to be continued. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure. And I'm so excited to share this conversation with so many others. And we should just make this like a Thursday morning conversation on and on and on. We'll just keep it going.
You brew the coffee.
Take care.
Bye bye.